So we tend to think of aesthetics courses as about a pretty rarefied experience that we can have when we contemplate a work of art. We often think of it as a bodily experience of pleasure, that you get when you go to these institutions we've set aside where you go and you contemplate art and get this kind of pleasurable satisfaction out of looking at art in galleries or museums. So this view of the aesthetic comes from the 18th century, when the study of aesthetics as a separate branch of philosophy really came into existence. And it's primarily through the work of the philosopher Immanuel Kant that we think of the aesthetic as producing this kind of bodily pleasure that usually comes from the experience of beauty, and that it's disinterested. It doesn't have any particular use. It's ideal when there's no other use um, suggested when we go and look at a piece of art, because we gain so much pleasure through this experience of beauty. So this is not the aesthetic tradition that we're going to be looking at in this course. We'll be looking at aesthetic. So aesthetic means bodily experience, but that bodily experience that derives from representations of tragedy, things that in life cause extraordinary human suffering. And what kind of bodily aesthetic experience do we have when we see that represented in art? The great source for this approach to aesthetic response in the Western tradition is not Kant, but Aristotle's Poetics, which was fundamentally a book about tragic drama. So the book is called the Poetics, but for Aristotle, there was a kind of hierarchy in the value of the various kinds of poetic writing. And for him, the highest value was from tragic drama, because it dealt with the important philosophical issue of our response as human beings to human suffering. And he also felt that our experience of represented tragedy produced good effects, salutary effects from a psychological perspective. Watching tragedy, in his view, produced a kind of catharsis. So that is a calming of one's emotions through creating compassion for those who are being represented. So the Aristotelian tradition was hugely significant in the Western tradition of art and literature as a response of compassion to a work of art. So for example, the bodily aesthetic response of compassion and its place in religious, ethical, and spiritual tradition in the West is central to works by Dante, Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, and others. So it's not dealing with that sort of rarefied aesthetic experience of beauty, but with an experience of tragedy and what that creates in human beings, and what it raises for human beings about one of the most, kind of profound mysteries of the human condition. So it's this tradition that this course will explore with a view to understanding the philosophical, theological, and psychological ideas that oriented how it was understood at different moments in that history. We'll look at the beginnings in people like the philosophical beginnings in people like Plato, Aristotle, Seneca. We'll look at its Christianization in people like Augustine, Dante, Shakespeare, Dostoevsky. We'll look at its deconstruction in modernity with people like Nietzsche, and its recovery in people like Simone Weil in the 20th century. So the question is, why is it important? Though it's often studied by those studying theater, for example, the tradition is often left out of philosophical aesthetics, which has been so governed by that Kantian tradition. And its double focus on beauty and aesthetic experience that does not provoke in us ethical desire. The aesthetics of compassion does just that. We will be looking at the art tradition in the West where compassionate concern for the suffering of others is central.